We have a human technician, Reese Alderman. Outer Reach Station, Independent Contractor Division. The others will underestimate him. Good, let him. The Karavith Diplomatic Station had been operational for 42 years. It processed treaty negotiations, resource allocation disputes, trade corridor applications, and the occasional crisis that came with managing the interests of 11 species across the Coalition's mid-rim territories. Its administrative staff numbered over 400. Its maintenance division numbered 63. Of those 63, 2 were human. The station's maintenance division was not considered a pathway to distinction. This was not officially stated anywhere. The division's charter described its function as critical infrastructure support, essential to the continued operation of Coalition diplomatic processes, which was accurate in the way that descriptions of plumbing are accurate. Everyone agreed with the words, and no one thought about them unless something stopped working. What the charter did not capture was the informal understanding that had developed over the station's 4 decades of operation. That maintenance work was a transactional arrangement. You were hired because you had a specific technical certification. You performed a specific function. You left when your contract ended or when a better credentialed applicant arrived. You did not expect to be consulted on decisions. You did not expect to be remembered. Reese Alderman had been on Karavith Station for 6 years. He was 31 years old from a mid-sized city in northern Ontario that most people outside of Canada had never heard of, and he had arrived at the station with a work history that his contract supervisor had skimmed rather than read because nothing in the summary column had suggested it required careful attention. Frontier. Independent system work. A stint on a deep array communications relay that had been decommissioned before he finished his contract there. Nothing that signaled seniority. Nothing that suggested he was anything other than a competent technician who had moved around a lot and was now, for reasons unspecified, working maintenance on a mid-rim diplomatic station. He had not volunteered reasons. He arrived, found his bunk in the contractor quarters, attended his orientation briefing, and in the 6 years since had conducted himself with the specific quality of someone who understood exactly what the work required, and was not particularly interested in the surrounding social architecture. The surrounding social architecture had largely returned the favor. The challenge came not from a colleague and not from a supervisor. It came from a senior diplomatic attaché named Vorath Keln, a Sethian 4th-tier functionary who had been stationed on Karavith for 8 months, and who had developed in that time a reputation for the particular kind of confidence that comes from being correct, often enough that one stops considering the possibility of being wrong. Seln was not a cruel being. That was the thing about him that made the moment when it came more instructive than it might otherwise have been. He was efficient. He was analytical. He had processed the available information about Reese Alderman, which was not much because maintenance contractors did not generate much information worth processing, and had arrived at an assessment that was reasonable given what he knew. What he knew was incomplete. The incident occurred during a technical review session for the station's primary environmental regulation grid. The grid had been underperforming for 11 days. Not failing. Nothing had reached critical threshold, but running at a persistent 7.4% below optimal efficiency in the atmospheric processing sectors, which over time created the specific kind of low-grade discomfort that people noticed without being able to identify. Slightly thicker air, slightly slower to equalize. The kind of degradation that generated complaints without generating clear diagnosis. The review session had been convened by Station Director Hessa Nyayam, who had the authority to convene such sessions, and who had decided, after 11 days of fielding complaints from diplomatic staff, that a formal review was preferable to waiting for the maintenance division to produce a solution on their own timeline. The room held 11 people. The station director at the head of the table, 4 members of the technical review board, all Sethian engineers with certifications that ran several lines in the station directory, 2 environmental systems specialists from the station's operations corps, 1 Velhari atmospheric consultant who had been brought in specifically because Velhari atmospheric chemistry was considered the current standard for enclosed environment regulation, Seln because the affected sectors fell under his operational umbrella, 1 junior systems analyst, and Reese Alderman because someone in the scheduling office had read the directive as include maintenance contractor responsible for sector maintenance, rather than include maintenance supervisor, and the maintenance supervisor had sent Reese rather than attend himself once he understood. The directive had already been actioned. Reese had been working his regular shift when the reassignment came through. He arrived with a datapad and a worn jacket and the expression of someone who had been told they were needed somewhere and had gone there. He found a seat near the end of the table. No one acknowledged him, which was not unusual. Director Niam opened the session efficiently. 11 days of underperformance, 3 diagnostics run, no clear fault identified. The Vilhari consultant, Shurev Thal, whose credentials occupied 4 lines in the station directory, had reviewed the diagnostic outputs and believed the issue was in the baroventric calibration sequence. A complex and typically expensive assessment to address. The technical board had concurred. The estimated repair timeline was 16 days. The estimated cost was listed in a figure at the bottom of the proposal document that Reese had been handed along with everyone else, and which he read once and then set face down on the table. Seln spoke with the tone of someone who had already reviewed the proposal and found it satisfactory. 16 days is inconvenient given the Aruvith negotiation schedule, but if this is what the technical assessment requires, then this is the timeline we work with. He looked around the table with the specific expression of someone closing a discussion. Are there any outstanding concerns before we move to implementation approval? He looked at the technical board. He looked at the Vilhari consultant. He looked at the director. His gaze passed over Reese the way it passes over the background of a room when you are looking for the people in it. Reese had been listening to the session with the stillness of someone who was not performing attentiveness, but simply present in the way that people are present when they are actually thinking about something. He had not spoken. He had not raised a hand. He had made 2 small notes on his datapad. He said, "The baroventric calibration isn't the issue." The room paused, not dramatically, not the way pauses happen in stories. The way pauses happen in rooms when someone who is not expected to speak does so, and the pause is less about the content of the statement and more about the recalibration of who has just spoken and whether the room needs to respond. Seln's expression did not change immediately. It changed in stages the way that confidence re-rates when encountering something outside its mapped territory. The Vilhari consultant has reviewed the diagnostic data, he said, with the patience of someone who is being precise rather than dismissive. His assessment has been reviewed and confirmed by the technical board. I know, Reese said. The baroventric calibration is running at 94.1% efficiency. That's not the cause of the problem. It's a downstream effect of it. Shurvthal, the Vilhari consultant, had the expression of someone who had not expected to have their assessment questioned in this room and was processing the experience. The diagnostic outputs indicate. The diagnostics ran for 17-minute intervals, Reese said. The cycling pattern on the underperformance is 23 minutes. The diagnostics are missing the tail end of each cycle, which is where the pressure differential registers. If you pull the raw telemetry from the sector logs rather than the processed diagnostic reports, you get a different picture. There was a specific quality to the silence that followed. It was not hostile. It was something more precise than that. The silence of a room where the people with the most credentials were running an internal check on whether what had just been said was possible and finding that it was. Director Niam spoke carefully. You've reviewed the raw telemetry. I've been working that sector for 6 years, Reese said. The grid has a cycling pattern that doesn't show up in standard diagnostic windows. I've documented it 3 times. The documentation is in the maintenance logs. Seln said with a quality that was no longer patience but something navigating toward it. Why was this not part of the initial diagnostic report? Rise looked at him for a moment, not with irritation, with the expression of someone choosing how to say something accurate. Because the initial diagnostic report was run by the automated system. The automated system doesn't cross-reference maintenance logs unless it's configured to. I submitted a configuration request 14 months ago. It's still in the queue. Another silence. A different kind. Director Niam said quietly, "Can you show us the telemetry?" It was not a question. Reese opened his datapad connected to the room's display system and pulled up the raw telemetry from the sector logs. He had already isolated the relevant data. He walked the room through it in the specific way of someone who has understood a problem thoroughly enough to explain it to people who haven't. Not condescending, not rushed, going at exactly the pace necessary for the material to be received. The cycling pattern was clear once the full 23-minute window was visible. The pressure differential registered at the tail end of each cycle, accumulating across the atmospheric processing sectors in a way that produced exactly the persistent low-grade inefficiency the station had been experiencing. The cause was a microfracture in a secondary pressure equalization valve in Maintenance Corridor 7, a component that cost 40 credits to replace and required 40 minutes of access time. Not a baroventric calibration issue. Not 16 days. Not the figure at the bottom of the proposal document. Shrev Thal looked at the display with the specific expression of a credentialed specialist watching data that they should have had access to and did not. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said, with the particular honesty of someone who takes accuracy more seriously than being right, the maintenance log integration would have changed the diagnostic output. Yes, Reese said. The technical board had a brief exchange in low voices. One of them pulled up something on her own display. She confirmed the cycling pattern against a secondary source. She nodded once. Seln was looking at Reese with an expression that was different from every expression he had worn in the room prior to this. It was not embarrassment. Sethian social architecture did not produce embarrassment in quite the way that human social architecture did. But it was something in the same territory, the expression of someone whose model of a situation has been substantially revised and is doing the work of updating. The configuration request, Seln said. 14 months in the queue, Reese said. I can send you the reference number. Something moved across Seln's face that was not satisfaction and not chagrin, something quieter and more useful than both. Please do, he said. Director Niam had been watching the exchange with the stillness of someone who had understood what was happening before it finished happening. She said, I'd like the full maintenance log cross-reference for all active diagnostic protocols submitted to my office by end of week. She looked at the technical board, then at the consultant, then at Reese, along with the list of any pending configuration requests currently in queue. She paused. Any of them. The room moved toward implementation. The 40-credit valve, the 40-minute access, the resolution of 11 days of complaint. The technical review session had been scheduled for 2 hours. It ended in 50 minutes. As people filed out, 2 members of the technical board stopped near Reese's position with the specific body language of people who had updated their assessment of something and were still working out what the new assessment meant. One of them asked a question about the cycling pattern documentation. Reese answered it. They asked a second question. He answered that one too. They left with the expressions of people who had learned something they hadn't expected to learn in this room today. Seln stopped at the door. He stood there for a moment, in the way of someone finishing a thought that had started somewhere before the meeting began. He turned back toward Reese, who was gathering his datapad and jacket from the end of the table. You said you submitted the configuration request 14 months ago, Seln said. 14 months and 11 days, Reese said. Seln looked at him with a steadiness that had a different quality than the steadiness of the beginning of the meeting. That is a long time to have a solution in queue while watching a problem you understand develop. Reese picked up his jacket. There's a process for this kind of request. I followed it. The process took longer than the problem. Seln said, You could have escalated. Reese looked at him for a moment. Those level eyes that had, Director Niam had observed across the session, not changed their character once based on the room's reception of him, only based on what he was actually thinking. I escalated once, he said. In year 3. I was told the configuration queue was not a maintenance contractor priority pathway. A pause. Not pointed, just accurate. So I kept the documentation current and waited. Seln left. Reese walked out of the conference room back through the station's main administrative corridor toward Maintenance Sector 7. He had the valve replacement in a kit bag he'd brought from his shift because he had pulled the telemetry 2 days ago and had already identified the component. He had not mentioned this in the session. There was no reason to mention it in the session. The session was for diagnosis. The repair was his job. He keyed open the access panel for Maintenance Corridor 7, settled into the specific focus of someone doing familiar work in a known space, and began. Director Niam stayed at the table after the room cleared. She had been the station director for 6 years. She had, in those 6 years, processed a number of moments that recalibrated her understanding of how the station functioned, and she had learned to recognize them while they were happening rather than in retrospect. This had been one of them. She opened her terminal and pulled up the contractor personnel file for Reese Alderman. She read it in the way that Alderman's original contract supervisor had not. Fully from the beginning, not skimming the summary column but reading the detail. The work history was not a history of moving around. It was a history of specific placements at specific moments. The frontier repair contracts had been for stations and relay arrays in the outer reach territories, which was where the coalition's infrastructure was newest and least documented. and where the gap between what the technical specifications said should happen and what actually happened was largest. The Deep Array Communications Relay had been the Varith array, which had a well-documented reputation in certain technical circles for producing a class of systems complexity that most contractors refused, and the ones who accepted rarely lasted full term. The stint there had run 14 months past decommission notice because the array had developed a failure cascade that the replacement crew couldn't resolve, and someone had called Reese back. She had not known about the Varith array. She was also looking at a pattern of maintenance log submissions, regular, thorough, cross-referenced, that had been filed consistently for 6 years into a system that had not been configured to use them. At the bottom of the file, in the notes field that contract supervisors occasionally used for informal observations, a previous supervisor had written, "Quiet. Doesn't flag problems unless asked. Recommend flagging him for retention." The note was 4 years old. No one had actioned it. Niam closed the file. She opened a new message window. She wrote 2 messages. The first was to the administrative queue supervisor, requesting an expedited review of all pending maintenance contractor configuration requests, with a note that items submitted more than 6 months prior were to be flagged as high priority for immediate review. The second was to Reese Alderman's direct supervisor, requesting a meeting at his earliest availability to discuss the contractor's current placement terms. She sent both. Then she opened the station's performance assessment template, the standard form used for annual contractor reviews, and considered it for a moment. The form had a field for assessment notes. The field was rarely used with any specificity. Supervisors tended to fill it with variations of meets requirements or performance consistent with role. She wrote 4 words. Understands the system entirely. She thought about that for a moment. Then she deleted it and wrote something more useful, a detailed summary of the session, the diagnostic gap, the documentation history, the configuration request, and the 40-credit valve that had resolved 11 days of station-wide discomfort. It was the kind of note that would survive personnel file audits and inform future decisions. She filed it and went back to work. In Maintenance Corridor 7, Reese Alderman replaced the pressure equalization valve. It took 38 minutes. He ran a calibration check afterward, watched the atmospheric processing efficiency climb back above optimal over the following 7 minutes, and recorded the completion in the maintenance log with the specific care of someone who understood that documentation was not bureaucratic overhead, but the mechanism by which knowledge survived personnel changes. He noted the valve serial number, the replacement date, the cycling pattern parameters, and the raw telemetry window that had identified the failure mode. He cross-referenced the entry with the previous 3 instances of the same cycling anomaly, so that the next person who worked this sector would have the complete picture without having to find it themselves. He submitted the log entry. He packed his kit, keyed the access panel closed, and started back toward the main maintenance bay for the remainder of his shift. He passed 2 environmental systems specialists in the corridor who had been at the review session. One of them stopped and said, with the directness of someone who had already decided what they thought, "That cycling pattern documentation. How long have you been tracking that?" "Since year 1, Reese said. The specialist looked at him for a moment with the specific expression of a person doing arithmetic about how long a gap of 6 years represents in terms of accumulated evidence. "The diagnostic configuration request is in the queue," Reese said. "As of today, I understand it may move a bit faster." The specialist said, with something that was not quite an apology, but was close to its more useful cousin, "Good." Rice nodded and walked on. He was not particularly interested in what happened to the configuration request now. He had flagged it. It would be handled or it wouldn't. His job was the documentation, the maintenance, the record. The rest was architecture. He had found, over 6 years on the station and several more years before that, in places where the work was harder and the acknowledgement was less, that this was a workable way to exist in institutional spaces, to do the work thoroughly, to document it accurately, to submit the requests through the correct channels, and to not require the institution to recognize the work in order for the work to matter. The atmospheric processing sectors were running at 101.3% efficiency by the time he reached the maintenance bay. Better than before the problem started. The valve replacement had also corrected a secondary calibration drift that had been developing for several months. He had noted that in the log entry, too, Seln submitted the configuration request escalation notice from his office at the end of the day's work. He was not required to do this. It was outside his operational mandate. The escalation pathway existed, and he knew of it, and he used it because the 14-month Q entry was a data point that did not sit correctly once he had thought about it carefully enough. He filed the escalation. He did not tell RIS Alderman he had done so. There was no mechanism for that kind of message and no particular reason to create one. He did, however, pull up the maintenance log archive for Reese's sector assignments and spend 40 minutes reading through 6 years of entries. He was not looking for anything specific. He was updating a model. The entries were thorough in a way that Keln had not expected and could not dismiss. Not merely detailed, systematic. Each entry cross-referenced with related entries. Each anomaly flagged with context. Each repair noted in terms of the broader pattern it belonged to rather than as an isolated event. The picture they assembled, read in sequence, was not the picture of a technician performing contractual functions. It was the picture of someone who had been paying careful attention to a complex system for 6 years and had written down everything they'd learned. There were 7 configuration requests in the archive. The first had been submitted in year 1. 14 months ago was the most recent. All 7 were in queue. Keln added all 7 to the escalation notice. Then he sat for a moment with the expression of someone whose model of a situation has been revised past the point where the original model is a useful reference point. He had been on the station for 8 months. He had walked past maintenance corridor 7 at least 200 times. He had not known this person's name until today. He filed the escalation and went back to work.